If you wanted to punch someone in an arcade during the 1980s, you had basically two options. You could either pick a fight with the person responsible for exchanging your hard-earned tokens for a novelty mustache comb, or you could drop your quarters into side-scrolling beat-em-ups. There was no shortage of scrolly punch-fests like this during the 80s, with games like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is a licensed game, and Kung Fu Master, which isn't, but was originally developed as a tie-in game for the 1984 Jackie Chan comedy film Wheels on Meals. Later, Nintendo would port that game to the NES under the name Kung Fu, dropping the word master from the title, possibly, and I'm speculating here obviously, to avoid reminding customers of a certain other 8-bit console on the market. Scrolling beat-em-ups were great for arcades who discovered that the combination of challenging gameplay and popular licenses resulted in machines that devoured quarters. There's a wealth of scrolling beat-em-ups that are original properties, but licensed games dominated the field well into the 90s with titles like X-Men, Dungeons & Dragons Tower of Doom, Alien vs Predator, and, inexplicably, The Simpsons, in which the evil Mr. Burns kidnaps the family baby because there's a diamond in it, leading the family to come together as a fighting foursome wreaking a path of destruction across Springfield in order to rescue the triangular-haired Todd. It's an odd license for a beat-em-up, but it was surprisingly good and became rather popular, so much so that we got another one 10 years later in the form of The Simpsons Wrestling, a game that the revered and largely fictitious PlayStation Gamer Monthly magazine gave a score of don't. Which just goes to show that sometimes it's about the execution, not the idea. For a long time, committing acts of violence in video games largely consisted of moving to the right and punching people over and over until they flickered away into nothingness, vanishing into the ether as their silicon souls passed on to wherever it is video game sprites go. But there were a handful of games that challenged that format. One of those games was Street Fighter, released in 1987, which saw you take control of a fighter named Ryu in one-on-one fights against increasingly difficult opponents, or, if you like, a second player-controlled fighter named Ken, who has fiendishly stolen all of Ryu's sweet kicks and flips in a brazen act of cultural appropriation. This game is largely forgettable and is nowhere near as sophisticated as later entries in the series, but it did cement a few franchise staples, including special moves and the 6-button controller configuration. It wasn't even all that successful at the time, but it was ported to pretty much every system going, including 2 ports for the Commodore 64, a PAL version developed by Tiertex for European territories, which was terrible, and an NTSC version by Pacific Dataworks developed for the American market, which was also terrible. Street Fighter was commercially successful and critically acclaimed, but there was little to keep people coming back to the machine, and its popularity dwindled. But this was 1988, and Capcom were very much in the business of making sequels to unpopular games, as opposed to today, where they're more likely to cancel sequels to successful ones. And so, a sequel to Street Fighter went into development, but the success of another arcade game ended up morphing it into something else entirely: Final Fight. Final Fight originally began development as a straight sequel to Street Fighter with the same one-on-one mechanic as its predecessor, but after seeing the success of Double Dragon in the US, Capcom shifted gears and indeed branding, and the game went from being a one-on-one fighting game to a more traditional, scrolling beat-em-up with almost nothing in common with its spiritual predecessor. The phenomenal success of Final Fight in the US led Capcom to raid its back catalogue of fighting games to look for something else to exploit, which, perhaps unsurprisingly, led them to revisit the game that got Capcom developing Final Fight in the first place. Which means, unsurprisingly, that we got this. Street Fighter 2 took 2 years to develop, 2 years which paid off as the game became a hit almost immediately upon hitting arcade floors. Between colourful graphics, strong character designs, and a combo system that came about accidentally as a quirk of programming, the game more or less single-handedly reinvented the entire fighting genre. You'd find cabinets at arcades, in bars, even my local swimming pool had a Street Fighter 2 machine, though they did eventually move it away from the pool area once they realised it presented an electrocution hazard. Later, the Super Nintendo version became a bestseller, and Street Fighter transformed from an old arcade game nobody really remembered into a cultural phenomenon. By 1993, every bugger and his mum knew about Street Fighter 2. Though in my mum's case, it's because I used to tuck my trousers into my socks and pretend to be M. Bison. Worries me that I related to the fascist dictator character. Over the years, there have been various iterations of Street Fighter II in the arcades, and all of these versions have had home console releases in one form or another. Some of these you'll know about. I don't know a single SNES owner in the 90s who didn't own at the very least a copy of Street Fighter II Turbo for their console, which might explain why this version was selected over Super Street Fighter II for inclusion on the worldwide version of the SNES Classic Mini. But I know what you're thinking. What about Ben? How did I get to enjoy this particular slice of early 90s culture? If your first guess involves the Commodore Amiga, congratulations! You know me well. The Amiga port was published by US Gold, a company with a reputation for, we'll say, less than stellar home versions of games, and was ported by Creative Materials, who also handled the Amiga ports of Final Fight and, okay, alright. Street Fighter II hit the Amiga around March of 1992, roughly a year after the game's arcade debut. The specific release date for the Amiga version has sadly been lost to the mists of time, but for me, it was Tuesday. Oh, f*** you. Anyone expecting me to praise this as a surprisingly faithful port of the arcade original is going to be disappointed. This is not the quick and slick Street Fighter experience you'll be used to if you grew up playing the game at the arcade or on the Super Nintendo. Movement is wonky, the frame rate is all over the place and less than ideal for a fighting game, and the music sounds like someone trying to recreate half-remembered tracks from the arcade version. But the biggest change in the Amiga port isn't the number of colours on screen or the gently baffling music, oh no, it's the controls. If you saw our Mortal Kombat episode from way back in our first year, you'll know that most Amiga owners only had a one-button joystick. Two-button sticks existed, but they were much less common. Most Amiga users had a joystick like this. The single-button joystick was a blessing and a curse for the Amiga. A blessing because it kept things nice and simple to figure out for an 8-year-old dullard like me, and a curse because it meant as arcade and home console games were coming out with increasing numbers of buttons and toggles, the Amiga versions had to be massively simplified. So a game like Street Fighter II, with its 6 distinct buttons for various strengths of kick, punch, it's all in the mind, had to be pared down to just a single button. Fortunately, unlike Mortal Kombat, which actually came out on the Amiga the following year, Street Fighter II also provided optional support for 2-button joysticks and offers a number of keyboard configurations for the purists out there looking for a Street Fighter experience that borders on but doesn't quite approach something authentic. Oh, and because the Amiga accidentally supports the Sega Genesis controller, you can kind of use that too, a little bit. So the music is different, the physics are weird, and the controls have been sanded down to the point where they're virtually unrecognizable. But how does this version compare to the original arcade version of the game? So my original intent at this point was to have a couple of my friends, Justin and Paul, who grew up playing Street Fighter II. Paul actually plays Street Fighter II on the tournament circuit, kind of film them trying to get to grips with the Amiga version. Only what happened instead was my Amiga died, which I'm still grappling with emotionally. So that's not happening. We're going to try to carry on with the rest of the episode like normal. Yeah, I'm a bit upset about that. The Super Nintendo version of Street Fighter II would be followed by a port of Street Fighter II Turbo, which would remain a Super Nintendo exclusive thanks to a contract between Capcom and Nintendo. That being said, Capcom managed to circumvent the exclusivity agreement by incorporating features from Turbo into the Genesis exclusive Street Fighter II/Special Champion Edition, the first Genesis game Capcom ever developed in-house, which was largely a port of Champion Edition and just happened to include pretty much every feature from the SNES exclusive Turbo port. This naturally left Nintendo feeling a little bit miffed, and so they launched into a multi-million-dollar lawsuit claiming massive loss of earnings. And no, I'm just kidding, Nintendo either didn't notice or didn't care, and the Genesis Special Champion Edition went on to become one of only 2 Capcom games to sell over 1 million units on a Sega console. A port of Super Street Fighter II inevitably followed, being released for the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo simultaneously, but this version also got ported to a number of other systems at the time, including the PC, the FM Towns, and of course, the Amiga. In fact, 2 versions were put out for the Amiga, an OCS version which featured reduced color depth for older Amiga systems, and an AGA version which supported the 256 color range of the AGA chipset included in the Amiga 1200 and 4000. A version was planned for release on the Amiga CD32 games console, but it was cancelled when it became apparent that it was 1995.
The Amiga version of Super Street Fighter 2 was ported by a different company, Freestyle, but still published by US Gold, which leads to the surprising discovery that it's actually not terrible. Once you get past how small the sprites are, small enough that I'd originally thought they were the same ones used in the Super Nintendo version, you'll find this is actually a pretty decent version of Street Fighter 2. The music is faithful, the physics feel a lot more authentic than those of its predecessor, even if the wider screen makes wall hops much more difficult to pull off, and it's actually halfway fun to play.
It even supports the Amiga CD32 controller, which makes this the first Street Fighter game on the Amiga to support a controller with 6 buttons. It's also the first Street Fighter game ever to support a controller that looks like an old-timey telephone that had been sat on by an elephant. Hello? Yes, I'm aware that joke doesn't quite work. Thanks for calling. Bye-bye.
But as with all halfway decent things on the Amiga, there is of course a catch. The OCS version of the game comes on 5 floppy disks, while the AGA version came on a whopping 7. That's by no means a record. Monkey Island 2 has that beat with 11 disks, and we all remember that pornographic hospital game from Germany that came on 19 3.5 inches, pause for laughs, but those were linear games that progressed from disc to disc. Super Street Fighter 2 has character data scattered across all 7 of its discs, and the loading time between fights will have you furiously and frantically swapping out one floppy for another until you inevitably die of old age before the fight itself even begins. Fortunately, unlike its predecessor, you can actually install this version of the game to a hard drive, which means that you only have to deal with the fact that the game is really good. Actually, I'm kind of running out of steam on this one, and we can't cut to Paul and Justin playing it. So let's move on! Super Street Fighter 2 was the last game in the series to get ported to 16-bit consoles, but wasn't the last game in the arcade series to get a home port. Actually, that was Hyper Street Fighter 2, but before that, there was Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, which didn't quite make the leap to either Sega or Nintendo's flagship systems, but did find its way onto the 3DO, which featured loading times in fight during complex moves, not unlike the PS1 port of Mortal Kombat 2, PC MS-DOS, which didn't bother to resize the character sprites, resulting in cramped visuals, and of course, an AGA Amiga port developed by Humansoft and published by GameTek in 1996. Visually, Turbo is a lot closer to the arcade original, and not only does this also support the CD32 joypad, but the game actually got a full retail CD32 release as well.
Which must have come as a bit of a shock to the 7 people who still owned one in 1996, but not as much of a shock as putting the disc into the system and finding that it runs about as well as a fresh batch of Grandma's famous trash souffle.
Super Turbo suffers a number of technical issues when played on the CD32 or an unexpanded Amiga, ranging from erratic frame rates to graphical glitches that make the game exceptionally painful to play. What's more, the Amiga version comes on an impressive 11 floppy disks, though the good news is that the game won't run from the disks at all. You have to install it to your hard drive, so if you don't have one, you're SOL. But how will our testing candidates find it? Let's throw over to them right now. We can't? Oh, okay. Shit. Alright, well, let's watch me play for a little bit in an emulator. How's I'm not very good, am I? Okay. Oh, you know what? Let's just close this episode out. I think we're done here.
And there you have it. Nearly 5 years after I initially promised it, I finally delivered the Street Fighter 2 special I've always wanted to make. Wonder how long it's going to take me to make the Haunted Mansion episode. Should probably make that the next one.
Still kind of heartbroken about the Amiga, but I will find a way to soldier on. Thank you for watching. Huge thank you also to Chris Failer, who acquired for me the Amiga CD32 controllers that appeared in this episode. I've been trying to get hold of those controllers for some time and could never find any that would ship to the US and that were affordable, and Chris came to the rescue, so huge thanks to Chris. We'll be back next time with The Haunted Mansion. Let's get it out of the way, shall we? And then it's done. In the meantime, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. I'm gonna go to bed.